welcome everyone to our webinar on investor-ready tech due diligence strategies for startups. My name is Phoebe Chester and I'm joined by my co-host Jorke Odolphi. So before we begin, we've just got a couple of housekeeping items to flag with you. Just make sure that you submit all your questions and Q&As at the end of the seminar. You'll receive the recording and slides in an email once we've finished. And you're welcome to leave any feedback in a survey once we're done as well. You can also claim a complimentary consultation for the next 48 hours with LegalVision. So you can discuss with us how we can best help your business, and you can provide your contact details at the end of the webinar. Okay, so today we'll be discussing the startup life cycle, the importance of tech due diligence, vendor and partner relationships, intellectual property, governance strategies, data privacy and security, important processes for cost optimization strategy, and integration management. And Jorke's going to kick us off.
Thanks, Phoebe. So we look at the startup life cycle. There's kind of 3 points that really stand out. You may be thinking of, say, merger and acquisition has been end state for a startup, acquisition as a possible exit opportunity, or when you're scaling, sometimes the best path is to, buy a competitor or allied business to grow your customer base, or perhaps investment from external partners. Or, after finding your product market fit, got your MVP going, you've struck gold and you're pivoting to follow it. And you may have a viable business that you don't have the resources to continue to grow in parallel to this new path. So there's value to someone else that's keen to pursue it. Instead of throwing that away, along with the customers you've worked so hard to get, you may consider divesting it. And moving on to looking at the anatomy of one of these M&A transactions. Go to the next slide.
Thank you.
Yep. At a very high level on the sell side, you may want to get your house in order and prove that, this is through the value of the tech due diligence process. From the buy side, you want to make sure the acquisition is going to align with your investment thesis. And maybe you want the technology, maybe you want the team, maybe you want the customers, and that's going to heavily drive what's important in your assessment.
Okay. And from a legal perspective, we know that startup owners are all, the most important thing is pursuing profitability, acquiring customers, and securing funding, really, when you're first getting started. And these things often take precedence over the critical aspects of your operations. So it's equally important to make sure that your business is continually conducting some tech due diligence. And when we talk about tech due diligence, what is it? So it's essentially the comprehensive evaluation of your business's technology assets, including hardware, software, data, and intellectual property. And this process of the comprehensive evaluation essentially aims to assess the quality, the scalability, the security, and the legal compliance of your technology in your infrastructure and your code base. So it helps investors or potential buyers understand the technical risks, the strengths, and the future potential of your business before making an investment or purchasing decisions. And you might be thinking, oh, I'm not quite at the selling stage yet. Why is this important for me or my startup? And it does come into play basically from the very beginning for a few reasons. If you're looking to gain funding at any stage, there's going to be a level of due diligence that has to get done. And also it's a mechanism to make sure that you're compliant legally from a number of bases. And if you don't have that, you can be subject to fines. So it's really important to just make sure that you're eliminating any potential future roadblocks to profitability, essentially. And there are a few key areas that are commonly examined during tech due diligence, as Jorke and I are going to discuss today. And these are essentially software architecture, code quality, third-party dependencies, data privacy and security practices, as well as IP ownership and the overall technical capabilities. Back over to you.
Cool, thank you. This is where we start with some of our take-home messages. And very simple one, the value of what you have is generally linked to how easily someone else can run it. And this can be hard to keep in mind sometimes, especially when you've built a business from scratch. It's your baby, right? But what someone else is looking to pay money for, this is the lens that they're going to be looking at it through. And this is partially why the technical due diligence process exists. We move to the next slide. The process for investor buyer to be able to ensure that they know what they're actually buying into, and this is what technical diligence is all about. What tech debt are they inheriting, and what will it take to fix things, and what risks they're exposed to? Tech due diligence can be just as important as financial due diligence, especially when they're looking to integrate into that technology. And historically, it's been focused on, risks and gaps. And many of those traditional liabilities have now been addressed by the cloud. So that means assessors can actually focus on understanding the value creation aspects of the deal rather than just those gaps. Areas you can show value in can be your security or your ability to adjust to market conditions, your IT automation, and really understanding what drives your cost and managing them effectively. If you want to see if a company is going to be a good fit when you invest and acquire them, you're going to have to care about how well the IT staff operate and how well their operations handle circumstances. Over to you, Phoebe.
Yeah, and very related to that point as well, Jorke, is vendor and partner relationships in general. It's a vital part of any startup, and no matter what industry you're in or how novel your business is, you will work with third parties in some capacity to deliver your product to the market. Most commonly, we probably see that through third-party cloud storage service, payment providers or processors, and even just website hosting services. So in our experience, we frequently see businesses really rush to scale growth and increase profits, so they don't pay a lot of attention to those agreements they're signing with vendors and partners in those early stages. And this can be quite risky from a tech due diligence perspective. So collaborating with external parties often involves sharing sensitive information, technologies, code bases. And because of this, it then raises questions about dependencies and compatibility and potential disruptions when you're considering due diligence from a third-party perspective. So our recommendation is essentially that startups should just carefully review all contracts and agreements with vendors and partners, paying really close attention to clauses that may impact their ability to operate independently if they have to move away from using that third party, or pivot the business model if needed, if there's an acquirer that wants to make some changes. Clearly defined terms and contingency plans are really crucial to protect the startup's agility and just to prevent future roadblocks. One very simple example of this that we see in clauses all the time in agreements is the assignment and novation clause. It's something that people skip right over, don't have to worry about that and sign it. But it can really cause a lot of headaches when these things have to get assigned, if there's new ownership or there's a change in control. So getting it right from the get-go can just make any acquisition really smooth. And the other thing to note with vendor and partner relationships is that acquirers and investors can actually be really wary of inheriting unfavorable contracts. If they are reviewing the contracts that you have in place and they see that they're really one-sided and they expose you to the risk of dispute or just that they're long lock-ins, this can really be a turn-off for investors. So it's another thing to think about. You might be willing to accept those terms, but is somebody else, and is it in the best interest of the business? Another really important point that Jorke and I are both going to touch on is intellectual property assets. It's probably the most important consideration when it comes to tech due diligence. And the goal of it is really identifying any gaps and plugging those gaps and just making sure that the framework of your IP ownership is as robust as it can be. So as you're likely all aware, intellectual property encompasses a wide range of intangible assets. It can include patents, trademarks, copyright, trade secrets, or proprietary software. And these assets are often the backbone of your startup. You've often done hours of research, you've invested in development, or you've just put in creative efforts even with your logo, with your name. That's all valuable IP. So when you fail to properly secure those assets, it can leave the business vulnerable to legal battles or to competitive threats from other similar businesses in the market. So one of the key IP concerns that startups should consider is the ownership and assignment of IP rights. It's essential to ensure that your startup has clear and unambiguous ownership of IP developed, whether that's by employees or contractors or a third-party service provider. You have to know who owns the IP, because neglecting this can really just lead to disputes. And yeah, it's not very favorable to look at from a due diligence perspective. Another really important piece of the IP puzzle is your branding. And we sort of received some pre-questions about this. It ties into the goodwill of your business and just the overall impression business can make. So you should make sure that your business is conducting thorough searches to make sure that they mitigate any potential infringement risks. So have you registered and protected your name and logo and key brand identifiers? Or are you at risk of being too similar to a competitor? And if a purchaser is looking to buy your business, part of that value can be in that goodwill and that reputation. So if you don't have it properly yours, you'll lose it. They can't buy that goodwill and reputation if a buyer has to change the name. So keep close attention to those, to protecting the trade secrets, confidential information, and proprietary processes, as well as all of the other valuable IP. And a simple way to do this is implementing really strong NDAs and security measures to make sure that you've got some good safeguards in addition to the IP ownership. Another important thing to note for tech due diligence from an IP perspective is open source reliance. And this is a really common pitfall we see startups fall into when they're building software on open source code. And it's really common that you've got developers that are playing around with something on open source and they find a nugget of gold. And this is where the business spark happens. It's from the open source. But open source licenses, as wonderful as they are in letting us use them, have a lot of limitations ordinarily. And the limitations will differ depending on which code you're using. But they can preclude you from commercializing it in some circumstances, or sometimes they can require you to publish the code that you've developed using them, which will mean that it's no longer proprietary to you, and you can't claim that it's your IP if you've sort of given it to the world for free. So you really need to be cautious with your reliance on open source, and if you're using more than one, just making sure that you've really kept track of in what way that's been implemented and have you got the necessary things in place to protect you, essentially.
Cool, thanks, Phoebe. And this moves on to our take-home message number 2. And like, there's the IP that you've developed, and that differentiates your company from others that they, investors could pick up or acquire. And there's the underlying operational construct of how it's actually run. So I like to say, make sure your IP is great and your ops are boring. If someone's going to invest in your company, it's going to be because your IP is interesting, not because you've come up with some new and interesting way to do continuous integration, continuous development, unless, of course, that is your IP or your product. Now, you could more follow broadly adopted best practices in these areas, and the more you're doing that and not doing unconventional things that could trip up a tech due diligence, or the ability for someone else to run your product longer term, which is going to translate into better value for your company. There will always be an intellectual property review during tech due diligence. One of the most common things that will come up, and honestly, it's sometimes overlooked. If they're doing a really rigorous due diligence, they will literally want to look at all of your code, including all the references, package, and open source things as mentioned that's included in what you see there. And as Phoebe mentioned, do you have the right to use this? Do you have the right licenses and those other bits of intellectual property in the way that you are? So if you are going to commercially sell an offering that uses a particular set of code, as there are lots of different newest licenses, it's not uncommon for someone to get tripped up, and they may incorporate that bit of IP into their product, and they don't 100% have the right to use that in the way it was used. You don't want this to be happen and be uncovered during tech due diligence. You don't want to be far down that process and uncover that. And one way we can really look at helping to avoid that is implement what we call, particularly for software products, is a software bill of materials. And as I can list out a few different tools, but one that's really useful from OWASP is a project called Cyclone DX, where it will interrogate or review your software and actually produce a list of all the open source licenses and the various licenses it finds in your software. Really easy thing for you to run across your software and have that very quick view of what's going on. And moving on to the next slide. So security is a top priority for AWS, and likely it should be for you. And it's not uncommon for an acquiring company to have stricter standards around security than the acquiree might have. And the key here is don't let that be a blocker during your due diligence process, because bad security audit can and has, and sometimes does, it will kill a deal, especially in a regulated market. You want to make sure you're ahead of these things. Things like least privilege automation, logging, multi-counter strategy, things that can be covered in what we call a well-architected review before we can encounter them in the technical due diligence stage.
Yeah, and on that point of security, goes hand in hand with really data privacy, which is something that is really important from a legal perspective and critical for every business, essentially. And this is something that probably speaks more to the third reason why due diligence from a tech perspective is important, and that's just to make sure that you're compliant with the laws. And if you're not, at the moment, the privacy regulations are that you could be fined up to $50 million. So it's really important to just identify any weaknesses in your system and essentially stomp them out. So data breaches and unauthorized access to sensitive data can result in, financial loss for you, regulatory fines, also irreparable damage to your company's brand. And it's common for, startups with limited resources and rapid growth to be particularly vulnerable to these risks if you're prioritizing other things. So we really recommend that every business implement a robust data security measures to protect against cyber threats. So this includes deploying secure coding practices, implementing firewalls and intrusion detection systems, and conducting regular security audits and penetration testing. Investors and potential buyers will also want to see that your business has the necessary documents to demonstrate its compliance. So this will often take the form of a privacy policy, a collection notice, a data breach response plan as the bare minimum. And don't forget that your business's privacy obligations will touch on several aspects of the business. You should be thinking about compliance every step of the way. For example, what type of information do you collect from your customers? How long do you keep that information in your tech stack? How do you disclose that information to third parties? Often people think they don't, but they're using a server overseas, so that technically is a disclosure. And if you're relying on automation in your business, you also need to be really careful about if that's really infringing on any of your privacy obligations, because there are, particularly in the GDPR and soon to be in Australia, some limitations around what you can automate when it comes to people's personal or sensitive information. We can't sing this one's praises enough, really, because we are expecting some major reforms to the Privacy Act in the next 6 to 12 months that will mean every business is going to need to adhere to a higher standard.
Cool, thanks, Phoebe. And on automation, one of the things we always like on the tech side is to automate everything. And it's one of the core take-home messages that we really should do as much as possible. Anything you're doing that's not automated, if you're manually deploying something in the console or in a ClickOps style, or you're mainly doing migrations or code deployment, that all translates to more overhead. More overhead, that equals less net present value for your business. So really, as much as possible, identify anything that's not automated and automate it. So one of the patterns, if we can move on to the next slide, one of our tips is around infrastructure automations. Goes into the overall governance strategy in terms of how you're actually running and deploying assets into your account. And this can help you really identify and be adherent to those, privacy requirements in those when you're doing a sort of multi-regional deployment. This comes down to things like we look at the control plane, change management, infrastructure as code, etc. One way to think of it would be, say, deploying some infrastructure using continuous integration and continuous deployment. So codifying your infrastructure allows you to treat your infrastructure as code, which then allows you to turn around and automate that through a number of tools. You can author your infrastructure as code in a code editor like VS Code, check it into a version control system like Git, and then review those files with your team members before you deploy. And we have customers that use CloudFormation, Terraform, Pulumi, CDK. There's lots of different ways around that. But making sure it's automated, it's not only great from an efficiency standpoint, but then from an audit and security standpoint, so that you're not manually doing things where someone could accidentally say, make an erroneous change in production, which of course would not be good. And I can definitely attest to as a fairly painful experience. Okay, so moving on to our next take-home message, what I want to talk about is about the overall operational robustness. There's an analogy here with purchasing a house. If you purchase a house that you know has good bones, And some like to say it needs a bathroom renovation, or the plumbing is a bit rough around the edges, the electrical system needs to be replaced. You could probably sell the house, but it's going to sell at a significant discount. Now, I'm not sure if that analogy actually stands up in the current market, but we'll go with it for now. And so in terms of thinking of how you structure your broader operations of your startup, that very much applies here too. Is something someone's going to be able to buy and then instantly run on their own? Or they're going to have to invest a lot of time trying to fix up things to their own standards? One area to think about here is how you've actually deployed, say, for example, your AWS infrastructure across your overall environment. Are you using a multi-account strategy? And have you turned on all your audit security controls? Moving on to our next take-home message there, it's all around cost. We want to make sure that you're spending as little as possible in terms of what you're building for your customers. And this, again, is really important during your tech due diligence process. So if you're getting ready to sell a company or not, or you really want to make sure that you want to make sure you're really understanding what's driving your cost and what each component is doing, and you're really comfortable with the value that it generates relative to its cost. This can be as simple as tagging resources in your account to generate cost reports. So moving on, there are a few examples where we can examine your spend and making sure you're looking at the appropriate business metrics and what's actually happening, and to make sure that you're comfortable with that. And specifically understanding the cost of all that underlying infrastructure. I constantly see items that are overlooked, and I absolutely love working with customers to generate some additional cost savings to drive that unit cost of your product down as far as possible. Now, moving on to our last take-home message for today. So let's say we've gone through our tech due diligence process. We've gone ahead with the investment or the acquisition. How do we do that in practice? Let's close the deal or hit the agreed milestones. So now we're talking about the synergies. So we can move on to the next slide there. Now, I don't know if anyone got any uncomfortable shiver down the back window, sort of hearing that word synergies. There's little to no value for a company to go through the trouble of acquiring another company if not for synergies, and the combined company's value really ought to be more than the sum of their separate parts. We look at the integration management, 80% of transactions historically fail to reach their expected value. Now, some of these reasons are not due to tech's fault all the time. There's culture fit of people and the overall operating model. But 70% of acquirers do inherit some technical debt, and where there is complexity, you'll need to untangle and realize that value. So from an integration planning perspective, you really want to integrate and really should consider much earlier in the process. As a buyer, you really want to know beforehand how important it is to integrate what you're buying based on the reasons you're buying it at all. So looking at the next part of integration management, if you're acquiring a company as a vehicle for growth, you need to understand how you might want to treat this company you've just acquired. You could possibly leave this company to run alone, time and effort to integrate their application and build your infrastructure of your own. In this case, you really need to understand what's the scope of the integration, what workload, what applications do you want to integrate when it comes to networking, security, and ops, the different types of accounts and how you want to do that, so and when. One example is I had a company had 10 AWS accounts, and the company they acquired had another 10 AWS accounts. But after the integration, they ended up with 12 accounts. Looking through each of the accounts during the due diligence process, they were able to assess the value of each, and this is all part of that integration planning. Meanwhile, another customer took the approach where they ended up with 21 accounts at the end of an acquisition, because the structure of what they were looking to leave was just leave their acquiring company alone. So basically what I'm saying here is let's make sure that the result you're intending to aligns with your investment thesis. So to summarize, some of the take-home messages, and I'll be around for Q&A and of course by email afterwards. The value of what you have is directly linked to how easily someone else can run it in the future. So keep it simple. Make sure you're not applying a not invented here thinking in your design so you don't hurt the value of a startup. Keep your IP great and your ops boring. More overhead is not more value. So it's the opposite actually. So for your business, automate everything. Make sure that you remove any fixer-upper discounts to your business by demonstrating that you're, raising the bar around your operational robustness in terms of how you're developing and deploying your infrastructure. And of course, know what your cost drivers are and optimize as much as you can. Last but not least, and we didn't go into too much detail, using loosely coupled architectures really empowers the synergies and integration in an eventual acquisition and investment scenario. And this is to make your company as attractive as possible from a technical due diligence standpoint. All right.
And from a legal perspective, to tie up everything we've sort of been talking about today, essentially, investors, we know the findings of tech due diligence can greatly influence their decision to provide funding or the terms of their investment. And if the due diligence process reveals significant risks or dependencies associated with vendor or partner relationships, it can raise flags about the startup's ability to operate independently, to scale effectively, or to pivot its business model if needed. Investors like to seek startups with strong competitive advantage, intellectual property protection, and operational resilience. Establishing a strong corporate governance framework and maintaining meticulous records is a crucial step for tech due diligence. So for all these reasons, it's essential to adopt a proactive and strategic approach to tech due diligence from the very beginning. And we don't expect businesses to know how to do this on your own, which is why we recommend relying on your legal counsel or tech experts to help you along the way. Okay, so that concludes the main part of our webinar. You might find this publication useful if you're interested in what we were talking about today. We've got a startup manual legal handbook for founders. We also have an upcoming event that may be of interest to you, winning enterprise contracts, legal tips for small businesses, and that's on on Tuesday, 3 September. We're also going to answer your questions shortly, so feel free to submit them while I take a minute to tell you about LegalVision's membership. By becoming a LegalVision member, your business gets unlimited access to our full team of 100+ specialist lawyers for all of your business as usual legal needs. It's like having your own in-house counsel for a fraction of the cost. Our team can assist with unlimited document drafting and reviewing, unlimited legal advice consultations, and unlimited domestic trademark registrations, and much more. So as a LegalVision member, you won't have to worry about the cost of lawyers ever again. Think of it as having your own in-house counsel. We'll take care of all of the business as usual legal work so you can focus on running your business. And if you are in-house counsel, we also offer dedicated service to manage your high volume business as usual legal needs. So if you're interested in learning more about that membership or our desk extension for legal counsel, you can request a free consultation when the survey appears at the end. And you can also contact Jorke with these details on the screen. Okay, so I think it's Q&A time. Did you have a question you wanted to jump into, Jorke?
I think there's one good one there, and it's there's one there from Tony around. We like to say automate everything, and you were saying there's limitations to what you can automate. And look, and to clarify, from a technical delivery, we like to have everything automated so we have that full auditability of the pipeline of everything deploys. So, and I'll say, look, when the law and the privacy requirements are changing all the time, and having that automation in place allows you to very quickly adjust what you're doing and be able to change those pipelines. So in those scenarios where you may not be able to have those kind of automations in, or you may have to have some sort of human in the loop processing with that. So I'm not sure if you can expand on some of the specifics around where bits can't be automated, but yeah, it should be.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with what you're saying in terms of, from a cost perspective, completely agree that automation is a fantastic tool that will absolutely help your startup. Where we just need to be cautious, and that's not to say don't do it all, it's just to say be aware of your obligations, is there are certain regulations that essentially, they try to stop you from automating a decision that might affect somebody in a certain way. Like, a classic example is banks deciding who they'll lend to. If there is some code developed to only accept applications that have basically something that relates to a personal or a sensitive information about a person. And the rule is just generally that there needs to be a human element to that. So even with those regulations, you can have a level of automation. There just has to also be human oversight to make sure that important decisions aren't being made without some human involvement, essentially. But those two things, sorry if they sounded a little bit inconsistent, they absolutely can exist at the same time. Another one, we've got a few that we sort of submitted prior to the session as well. One of them was about how does tech due diligence differ when you're at pre-seed stage with the startup, if you're at seed stage, or if you're at Series A startup? And you might have some thoughts, Jorke, on the technical ways that it differs. From a legal perspective, the difference is probably the formality. When the earlier on you are, with the sort of pre-seed trying to gain funding, generally there's a lighter level of scrutiny that goes on. We sort of just want to make sure that things look about right. And then the more your business progresses and the due diligence progresses, it can become a lot more detailed, where, like Jorke was saying before, with the code example, they might want to look at absolutely every line of the code and understand its source and make sure that there's no open source dependencies or that there's ownership. So that's kind of, not to oversimplify it, that's probably the main difference. But the goal with all of them is the same. Whoever is looking to invest or to buy just wants to identify the risks. Are they buying something that's going to end up being a money or a time suck? So they will look wherever they can under the hood to find that.
Yeah, I think you absolutely nailed that. It's all about the risk at this point. Yeah, I've been through a couple of due diligence on both sides. One was effectively pre-revenue, pre-seed, pre-everything investment, and that was a very detailed code level review. Part of that was the IP associated was a couple of patents that were developed along. So it that makes it a bit quite different. But most pre-seed customers that I've seen, it comes down to your capability of your team and their ability to execute on an idea. And it's less about what you've got as far as code assets are at this point, but more about the level of risk that they're going to be actually inheriting at that point. Because if you've got the right team and the right idea, you can very quickly pivot the code and change things around.
I've got another question that's sort of, it's related, and it is important from a due diligence perspective about company structures, and particularly talking about patents there, Jorke. This question was saying, when you're structuring the IP holding company, does it make sense for the patents to sit with the IP holding company rather than the operational company that might sit underneath it? This is a bit of a complex question, and we basically say get in touch and talk to a lawyer about it. Generally, there can absolutely be benefits in having your IP sit with a holding company, but there can be some tax considerations that can really differ quite greatly depending on what your business is doing and how, that you should take into consideration. And another important sort of caveat to a lot of people will say holding co always for IP, and you need to be really careful with certain types of IP. Trademarks is one that it can be really detrimental to do that if the holding company isn't sufficiently using the IP itself. We've seen some case law where a holding company won't be the owner of the IP and their opco will be the one using it. And a competitor has come in and basically attacked them with a non-use application where they've sort of said, no, you, the holding company, haven't used it, your opco has, and the licensing wasn't strong enough to essentially show that that was authorized, and they've lost the trademark. So it's great to be thinking about it, and definitely great to be thinking about it early on in the establishment. But I would basically say it's not a one case fits all. Get in touch and we can chat about the best solution for you.
Yeah, I got that wrong, I have to say, when I had my two patents. And yeah, I end up with a bit of a tax implication around it. So yeah, definitely get in touch with some good legal representation. Yeah.
Okay.
There's one there I'll just pick up from Sam. He's actually, any advice you would have when building exclusively on open source? So running a Python app and Django. Can we use open source libraries? Python and Django are open source, and the whole ecosystem is essentially open source. Generally, this will be okay if you've got the strength of what you're building on top of these pieces of software is strong enough to be a business. This can be okay. The one thing I'd encourage is have a look at building that software builder materials, so understand the licenses that are underneath, particularly looking for things such as GPL-based licenses and not modifying those kind of things. the software which I mentioned was Cyclone DX, and I'll drop the link into the chat in just a moment if that in response to your question there. It'll generate a list of all the licenses that are currently in use by the software and also by any inherited libraries. And this allows you to get a view of, okay, I can commercialize on this library, I can't commercialize on this one. This one is purely specifically for research or so on. It gives you that view. So absolutely fine to building an open source. That the startup I had was pretty much built primarily all on open source, and we just were very forthright in building out that list of licensing that we can actually make sure that everything's all right on that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Just make sure we're looking at the license, and the better record keeping you have, the more protected you are. If you have a clear idea of where your business wants to go and what it wants to use it for, that can really help as well to make sure you're using the safest, the most appropriate open source code. Because some of them absolutely allow you to commercialize, some of them won't require you to disclose everything you've built on top of it. So it's really just taking the care to be a bit strategic about it, essentially.
There's one I'd pick up from the pre-submitted questions there around IT platform for a data room. Now, data rooms are interesting. I'm not sure if you've had much experience with using the data rooms, but there's a lot of vendors who are selling data room services. And in the experience that I've had, the three kind of data rooms that I've used have been Dropbox, Box, and Google Drive. So not just using fairly standard file sharing technologies. The main thing to be concerned around when you've got a data room environment is ensuring that you have very strong governance and controls, and you've got someone that's appointed to control access to that environment. But you should be, I think at a startup stage, it's pretty rare for you to require to have the same sort of rigor in data rooms that you see from very large organizations. I'm not sure if you have a different view on that one.
Yeah, Phoebe. I completely agree. I mean, I've worked on dozens and dozens of DDs, and I've seen a whole host of different ways of doing it. The benefit of the sort of bigger providers is purely the organization that it can offer when there's so much in a data room. But as far as security goes, a lot of those smaller vendors or more common ones like a Dropbox are absolutely sufficient. And exactly as Jorke said, as long as you've got good management control and it's not being accessed by the wrong people, and you've got, clear NDAs in place if people are viewing things that they might ordinarily not, then that's usually sufficient. They can be pretty rudimentary. They don't have to be that jazzy. Okay. So I think we'll just see if there's any more questions. If we haven't gotten to your question, we can always get in touch afterwards. It might be that it's best that we chat more in depth about it with Jorke or I. You're welcome to reach out. I'll just see if there's anything else we can address now.
I got one which is kind of interesting that popped out in the pre-submitted questions. Any considerations for generative AI and large language models in preparing tech due diligence? Really interesting questions. I would kind of say potentially for helping to summarize and produce some of the documentation, but I don't see a huge benefit from, I guess, the production side. So if you are the person at the startup producing the documentation to be provided, there's probably less information, less usefulness from an LLM. You potentially do some help. You probably could be a few things to do analysis of code if that's what your acquirer is looking for that, but that's nothing that's really that novel, to be honest. And I would be very wary about some of the outputs from LLMs as well, particularly as it can be a bit verbose and also not really generating things that are that useful.
Yeah, I agree with that. That is a really interesting question. I think from a legal perspective, it ties in a lot with what we were talking about today, actually. If you're generating if you're sort of using your own inputs in your own company for the generative AI, it's the same questions around IP. Do you have the right to be using it in this manner? And privacy. Are you inputting personal or sensitive information? And are you intending to get it to generate, to analyze that information to make a decision about someone where there should be a human doing it instead? But it's all really the same principles. It's just the tech is a bit more novel, the application's a bit more novel, but the principles are really the same. Do you own it? Are you able to use, are you relying on the output as if you own it? You need to be a bit cautious around that, because under Australia and internationally, really, it has to be a human author for you to be entitled to IP protection. So if it's 100% generative AI, you're not likely to be able to claim that as your businesses. So it's very similar principles. And I think we've actually done a few presentations on this in the past. So we might be able to track one down and send a recording to you if you're interested. But something to keep in mind, but along the same lines of everything we've discussed.
Yeah. One thing to touch on too, depending on your choice of platform and model as well, be aware of what they're doing with the data that you're providing to that LLM if you're using that LLM. So if they're going to take the data and actually use that for their own training purposes, that can be a huge red flag for potential review.
Yeah, and even on that point as well, Jorke, I guess from privacy law perspective, that's technically a disclosure you're making. If you're putting in personal information and they're using it for training or they're using it for another reason, you're going to be at a certain point held accountable for how they use it. If they have a data breach, it can be your data breach because you're the ones that provided it to them. So definitely good to be cautious. Okay, so I think that's all the time we have for questions. So sorry if we haven't gotten to your question. Just get in touch if you'd like to get some more information on any of that. And don't forget you're entitled to that complimentary consultation if you're interested. And there's also a quick survey at the end that we'd love it if you could complete. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
We'll see you next time. Bye.